Our next speaker is Dr. Patrick Fraley. Dr. Fraley graduated from the University of Arkansas for medical sciences and completed a 5-year surgical residency in ear, nose, and throat and head and neck surgery at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. He currently practices in Conway, Arkansas, and after his own experiences in family court, became the co-founder of Arkansas Advocates for Parental Equality in 2015. He is the proud father of 1 son. Welcome, Dr. Fraley.
Thank you. Thank you for my lovely wife who introduced me. Let me get this set up real quick. It really is an honor to be here. I'm going to be talking about the evidence behind shared parenting, just because I come from a medical background, reading scientific evidence and articles and everything is kind of something I'm used to and good at, so I felt very comfortable with this, and hopefully I can help you guys along with it as well. So, seems like a simple question. Why do we need evidence? So in medicine, we're taught to practice evidence-based medicine. I think when it comes to this, we need evidence-based policy to have what's best for our kids. We're here because we want better for our kids, for ourselves as parents, and really for society as a whole. History is full of good intentions, but things haven't always gone so well. It's a frontal lobotomy down at the bottom. Someone thought that was a good idea at one point. We don't really do those anymore. We want to make sure that what we're doing for our kids is in their best interest, not just some crazy idea that we're coming up with. We can only know this if we gather evidence and if we examine that evidence. And unless you're the researcher, we have to rely on the evidence that other people put forth. So where do you start? If you haven't really looked for this kind of information, you really don't know where to. I would suggest review articles is a good first place. These are a great introduction. What they do is they summarize multiple prior studies. And again, I want to emphasize, I guess a good review article is a good place to start. What you can do after you read this article, and it gives you lots of good background information as well, is you can chase down and read the references at the end, and that's really where some of the most important stuff comes from. Don't always take someone's opinion of what someone else said, because 3 or 4 people down, you kind of lose the original intent. You do need to watch for selection bias or author bias. Author bias is pretty self-explanatory. Selection bias would be if you have a review that looks at the 5 worst examples of shared parenting and says, oh, this is a review. That's selection bias. They've chosen something for a certain agenda. When you're looking for this stuff, you can just simply Google it, but typically there are specific search engines. I'm used to PubMed, Google Scholar is out there, ScienceDirect I think has an easy engine to do. Phone a friend is kind of an obvious answer. There is a hierarchy of evidence. Generally at the top and given the most weight is going to be systematic reviews, which is like the review article is at the top. A meta-analysis is similar. This is a statistical systematic review, so it generally holds a little more weight. Following that is randomized controlled trials. We're not going to see really any of those in divorce. It's kind of a bad idea. Cohorted case-controlled studies are very common. Expert opinion is at the bottom. And then I want to emphasize, not a web article, blog, or God forbid a meme. These are not evidence. When you read these articles, you need to look at several things. So who wrote it and where is it written? Location is important. A lot of stuff that I'm going to talk about, some of the negative things, come out of Australia. They had some changes in their parenting laws. What happens in another country isn't always what's applicable here. Look for author bias and intent. They have a reason why they wrote this review. We all have good and bad intents, and we do our best to try to hide those if we're doing a scientific article. Who published it? Is it a good journal? Is it a bad journal? Is it a peer-reviewed journal? If it's published by the government or by a private company, it probably was not peer-reviewed. Peer-reviewed means that you have other people in the specialty that read through it before you publish it and say, it might call you out and say, you know what, this is a bad study. If it's published by some private company, it has not gone through that. Look at the definitions when you start. Joint custody isn't always what we consider joint custody. A lot of these studies will say a minimum of 25 or 35% time with each parent. Look at the population that they study. Is it across the board, or is it high or low socioeconomic status? Is it just in high conflict couples? Look at the methodology. Is it a prospective or retrospective? Meaning, did they start out and get the data, or did they find data and then try to get where that came from? And how was that data gathered? Was it a survey? Was it observation? Was it from state databases? And then finally, are these conclusions based on the evidence? So I'm going to jump right into the articles now. A lot of these names you've already heard while you're here, and I think these are some good things I picked out because they've already been referred to. Linda Nielsen has done quite a few. She does a lot of reviews, and one was published just last year that I think is really good. What this one did is it reviewed all 60 English language studies comparing the outcomes for children of joint or sole custody. They looked at outcomes for academic, emotional, behavioral, and physical health, as well as parent-child relationships. They additionally looked to see if those outcomes were due more to conflict or income level. What they found was more than half of those studies showed that joint custody was better than sole custody on all measures. On 14 of them, joint was better than sole on some. 6 showed no difference, and then 6 showed it was actually worse on one measure, but better or equal on the other measures. Good news that the outcomes were independent of conflict or income level. Take-home message from this one is going to be that there's the vast majority of the evidence supports joint custody on most measures. And even though this is a big review, this is something we call convergence of the evidence. You've got 60 different things that look at it, and they're all essentially coming to the same conclusion. That's, in a lot of times, better than 60 studies doing it the exact same way that give you the same answer. This next one was done, it's very similar. I'm going to skip a little bit past this one. This was a meta-analysis done very similar to the Nielsen article. Came out with the same outcome, except being a meta-analysis generally concludes a little more weight to it. High level of evidence that children in joint custody do better. We've heard Richard Warshak mentioned a couple times here. He published a consensus report in 2014 that included the opinions essentially of 110 of the leading researchers and practitioners from around the world. They came out in support of the practice of shared parenting for children of all ages, including infants and young children. And this is kind of why it was published. There had been some studies before this that questioned whether or not it was good in young kids. This answered the question of, yes, it is. They did then emphasize that there was a need to have a continued relationship with fathers after divorce. What's nice is it did review in moderate detail several of the studies on shared parenting, as well as some of those that were against it. Consensus here being the experts agree joint custody is appropriate for all ages. This is probably my favorite of the studies. What do the kids think? So we're getting, how do the kids turn out, but how do they actually feel about it? William Fabricius published an article in 2003 out of Arizona State University. This was a questionnaire of 829 college students of children of divorce, and basically asked their opinion. What they found was students wanted more time with their fathers and believed that equal parenting time was best. And this includes ones that did not have access to both parents. Students believed their fathers wanted equal time and mothers wanted primary custody, which is, I think, something we kind of learned by Gestalt. The closer to equal time meant better relationships with both parents, meaning that if you had, just because both parents had custody, you actually had a better relationship with that rather than if one parent had sole custody. You don't get better relationships because of sole custody, even with the sole custodian. The students perceived that their mothers engaged in more undermining behaviors toward the other parent, and this actually correlated with anger towards that undermining parent in later ages, or later years. And then a really interesting note was that the top reason that students perceived they didn't spend more time with their fathers was that mom, quote, just wanted to have me with her. So this is what the students are actually thinking. The take-home message here is that kids prefer joint custody, and they can actually have negative opinions of these sole custodians. So that's what the kids think. What do the parents think? Bauserman did a meta-analysis of this in 2012, looked at parental satisfaction, conflict, relitigation in joint custody versus sole custody, in 32 samples over a 30-year period. What they found was joint custody had equal or better father-child relationships, parental stress, parental conflict, relitigation, and overall adjustment. So all good things. The satisfaction was greatest for mothers and fathers when they had sole custody, which I think is self-explanatory. It was in the middle if they had joint custody, and then the least satisfied were those that were non-custodial parents. So you can't make everybody happy, but if you want everybody to be medium happy, joint custody is where you have to do it. Joint custody had lower relitigation for child support. They did find there was higher relitigation for custody modifications, but they did point out that most of these were adjustments within joint custody, not a change to sole custody. Take-home message here is that benefits of joint custody to the parents outweigh the negatives. This is something that's come up multiple times with the Kentucky law. What happens when you put these domestic violence clauses in with your laws? Unfortunately, someone's looked at that. This was a study that was done out of the Notre Dame Law School by Allen in 2011. They looked at the difference in custody orders in Oregon before and after 1997, when there was a custody law that went into place. But it wasn't a presumption, but it made it go from unfavored to favored status, essentially, something similar to what we have in Arkansas. However, it did include a language exempting cases of domestic violence. What they came up with was that sole custody to mothers went down, sole custody to fathers went up, and joint custody remained exactly the same. So we're here for joint custody. We're not here to shift custody back and forth from one parent to another. So you have to be careful with what these clauses do to your laws and what the outcomes actually are. They also found there was an increase in abuse allegations after 1997 from both mothers and fathers, and this obviously includes false allegations. So again, be careful what you ask for. Take-home message is joint custody laws with domestic violence clauses don't necessarily increase joint custody and may increase abuse allegations. And then Edward Crook has also been mentioned here. This was a recent publication he did that I think is good for us as we're trying to get laws passed. It discussed what he called the 3 waves of arguments against shared parenting over time. The first of which was the outdated attachment theory that suggested children form bonds with a primary parent and they should not be separated. This is essentially disproven in the 60s. People kind of hung on to it throughout the 70s and 80s though. The next wave was that joint custody would expose children to higher conflict and family violence. This has more or less been refuted as well. What we're currently having to face is that people say shared parenting might work in some cases, but it should not be a presumption. What he does, and what's nice about this paper, is it goes on to refute each of these arguments, including both just general reasoning as well as some scientific studies, and then the references for those studies. The end statement was that shared parenting now has enough evidence that the burden of proof should now fall on those who oppose it rather than those who promote it. The take-home message from this study is it's useful as an index to answer specific questions as we're trying to get these laws done. I can't really do a good talk on evidence for joint custody if I don't mention just a couple of the things against joint custody. No matter the situation, there will always be dissenting voices and even dissenting evidence. Lots of reasons for this. Opposing evidence can come from random chance. Just the rules of statistics says 1 out of 20 is going to be due to random chance. It could be a bad study design, it could be researcher bias, or you know what, it may be true. You can't win on every measure. In the end, though, the evidence to support joint custody far outweighs the evidence against it. So one of the bigger ones was done by McIntosh out of Australia. Again, they had these law changes kind of in the mid-2000s, and people were looking to see how that impacted things. It was a combination of 2 different studies that were done here. One of them was a non-random sample of 133 families, including 69 of shared parenting that were classified as high conflict. And you can kind of see where some of these problems are. What they found was that shared parenting was a less stable arrangement in these, and there was even more conflict after you got it. The more rigid the schedules, the more litigious, the higher the conflict, and the lower the cooperation. The kids actually reported feeling caught in the middle, they were least happy, and they wanted a change. Our refute to this is essentially going to be that this is not applicable to the general population. We're not trying to get it for the highest conflict. You can have conflict and get shared parenting, but for the, quote, high conflict, it's a tough thing to sell, and it's not always the best case. Another study that was a part of this one was a random cohort of about 2,000 kids in Australia, followed over time. They looked at a bunch of different factors they came out with, and essentially they decided that infants were more irritable and insecure if they had more overnights, but they asked this question only of the primary parents, not of the non-custodial parents. The toddlers of shared parenting showed less persistence at tasks, but no matter what, by age 5, all the outcomes were equal. So this is the best they could do. They say by age 5, it all comes out in the wash. Some other arguments used against this is that it used non-validated measures to make these conclusions. For example, the primary parent said, my kid's staring at me more, and they interpreted this as the kid was more insecure. I don't know what that means. If you don't wash your hair one day, your kid can stare at you more. Who knows? No matter what, though, everything came out even by 5 years. One that followed this was in the United States by Tornello in 2013. This took a bunch of data from their Fragile Family Study. This focused on inner city kids. They were impoverished, never married, low education minorities with high levels of incarceration. So again, you can see where I'm going with this. It's not really generally applicable. They found that frequent overnights were associated with attachment insecurities at age 1, kind of indeterminate at 3, and by age 5 it was all equal. There were also some non-validated measures used here, and similar to the other study, they only looked at the mother's responses because there actually weren't enough fathers to give responses in this study. Another publication done the next year used the exact same set of data and came up with a conclusion that, you know what, everything comes out in a wash from the beginning. Our take-home message from this is that it's still not applicable to everyday fit and willing parents, and no matter what, all differences went away by the age of 5. The last one here, I heard Wallerstein mentioned yesterday. She's kind of the godfather, or really the godmother, of the anti-shared parenting movement. This was a 25-year follow-up that she published back in 1998, and there was even a book that followed after that. But this was fairly influential when it came out at the time of publication. I think California based some of their relocation laws off it. The Canadian Supreme Court based a lot of their stuff off it. What she decided, or what she did, it was a very, very negative portrayal of father-child relationships. It suggested that kids don't want joint custody and they prefer to live with one parent, which was the mother in all of these cases. The only real conclusion she came up with was that children of divorce have problems. One of the things she seemed to advocate but never came out and said was that kids should live with their mother, and she did not want a set visitation schedule. The more set it was, the more the kids didn't like it. So she advocated anarchy as the visitation schedule. It had no control group, no data, no statistics, no methodology, and it was not a random sample. So really this is a narrative, it's not a scientific study. So again, that's the best there is against joint custody. I don't know if we have any time for questions. I know this is a lot of data in a short period of time.
We can take 2 questions.
Okay. This is the website. It's our website, but if you go there right now, it's a dummy page, but I'm going to post this as well as all these articles because it's good for us to read them if you can. Basically, it'd be a library of the evidence for shared parenting. I think it's something we can all have, and hopefully I'll have a little more extra information there to be helpful.
If they're available. We come this way so we
Sure.
don't hit that speaker.
Thank you for the presentation. With Wallerstein, my understanding was she was looking at the children of divorce. I didn't know anything about the shared parenting, but I've got a lot of comments from people that have said, you know, we went through a divorce because of my husband or my wife cheating, shacking up with somebody, and the children don't like being there in that scenario. They don't like to go over and be shared parenting when they're seeing their father with a girlfriend or their mother with a boyfriend. How do you respond to that? Because I think that there are some very legitimate concerns, even just the fact that you may be normalizing something that that was destructive of a family. So, I mean, that's one of the instances, and I may not be the only one, but I mean, that's one of the things that I think you've got to look at. What about the morality issues? What about the things that bring confusion like that? Anyway, I'd love to hear your comments.
I think that puts the needs of the parents above the needs of the child. I mean, it sounds like they've got their issues, but don't have an affair, but if you do, does that make you a bad parent? I don't think so. Should that make you lose custody? I don't think so. So that really puts the needs of the parents above the needs of the child.
Do you think
So
that
unless
also...
you're harming this
Right.
child, joint custody is the way it should be.
Do you think that in any way rewards...
Use the mic.
Okay. Do you think when we talk about issues of justice and so on, do you think that punishes an innocent spouse and rewards a guilty spouse, victimizes somebody who really should not have been in that position, and rewards somebody else for behavior that we should be condemning as bad?
I don't know if I have a good answer to that one. I think that people do bad things and get rewarded for it all the time in family court, but I don't really have a good answer of
Okay.
Obviously it's not the right thing.
Last question.
Let's go back to the negative statistics that you had up briefly. I didn't get the name of that one. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. Okay. An actual question.
In a high conflict custody battle, how would you use this research? I mean, I know it's personalized to your own circumstances, but how can we ask the judge to consider these studies, and unless there's some outrageous evidence comes up, then the study should help you make the decision?
Yeah, so high conflict, we say high conflict, and it's not always high conflict. You can have conflict, and you can have a relatively high level of conflict, but when people say, study-wise, high conflict divorces, you're talking the worst of the worst. For those of you that can't agree on shared parenting, for those of you that have conflict, I mean, you're getting divorced, so there's going to be conflict. But even for these, 90% of people with this conflict, that's not going to be high conflict. And for those, these studies show that even if you have conflict, the benefits to the kid remain. And the conflict doesn't get worse between the two parents. So there's only good that comes out of this. But yeah, don't be thrown off by the buzzword of high conflict. High conflict, if you have lots of conflict, that does not make you a high conflict couple or divorce.